So in this position, we're playing white, and we have a queen for a bishop, which means obviously we're playing for the draw. If we look at the e2 pawn, it's way too close for the back rank promotion for us to be really comfortable playing anything. Notice that the white queen is stuck pinning the e2 pawn to the king. If we try to get some activity with something like queen to d2, threatening queen f4, black can simply kick us away with bishop to e3.
Or g5 for pairing f4, and the passed pawns are becoming too dangerous. Our queen can't do anything alone because if it leaves, the black will promote his pawn. So therefore, white needs to also activate his other pieces and keep the opponent's ideas in mind.
Exactly. Also keep in mind that one pawn is dangerous with a king, but what's even more dangerous is two pawns and a king. Black is actually threatening to push f4, then f3. And then after king to f1, the e1 promotion will be inevitable. So we have to activate our pieces. Well, if we can't activate the queen, obviously we need to postulate the king.
And to do that, we need to widen the beachhead.
With pawn to h4. Now we're allowing our king to activate and help with the defense. Black would like to play g5 here, but we have queen takes f5 check. So first, black needs to move pawn to f4. After f4, we go king to h2. Then after black tries to bring his other pawn in with g5, h takes g5, pawn takes g5, we postulate the king again with king h3.
In this position, our king is very active, and black's pawns are never going to win the game, because whenever black plays f3, we're going to play king g4, and king f1 is never going to be strong because we have king takes f3.
And queen d3.
Yes.
After pawn to f2, king to g3, black is never going to be able to promote his pawns because of this pin. If he tries to come this way, of course, we can just take on e2.
As if they promote, we have queen to h2 checkmate.
That is correct.
And that concludes this position.
So Elijah, whenever you first gave me this position, I put the engine on and let it think for a long time. In fact, it reached depth 44, but it still said white wasn't winning. Why is that?
Probably you forgot to include the new updated postulate engine that adds at least 100 rating points. But anyways, we need to activate the king, obviously. The king postulate is the most important principle in the endgame. Shereshevsky makes this clear. Well, he called it centralization of the king, but it's basically the same thing. And here we're targeting the opponent's pawns. King c4, intending king b5. And this may seem all well and good, except the opponent has f6, removing the defender of the c5 pawn.
Should we move the rook away?
The real question is, who cares? King b5. Of course, the engines got confused, but it's all good. So f takes e5, c takes b6, king e7. They try to centralize their king, but they're a bit late for that, b7, rook b8, king c6. We're threatening king c7, so they play king d8. And now the simple zugzwang f3. We're going to go win the pawn endgame soon. They'll have to give up the rook. And then we're going to win because of our queenside passer.
And that concludes this position.
This position came from one of Gelfand's games, and he did not play the right continuation. He chose to win a pawn with rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, bishop b7, but this was incorrect because the opponent will centralize their king and have excellent compensation. We're never going to use our a pawn. It can't get to a4. They're just too active. Gelfand's excuse was that he moved instantly, and that's why he did not find the right continuation. That if he thought even for a few seconds, the king's centralization would be far too obvious for him to miss, and it would be very easy for him to win the game.
Exactly. Right here, a pawn is worth a lot, but not if the enemy king is postulated. Instead, we postulate our own king to f2. Now, if rook takes e3, king takes e3, our king is quickly heading to the b6 square and be taking the a6 pawn.
Let's not forget that centralization of the king is such an important endgame principle because it's usually the least active piece earlier in the game. And of course, we don't want any of our pieces to be out of play, so activating it as fast as possible is the best way to go. And the center is usually the most active way.
And that concludes this position.
This came from Judith Polgar's game when she was 9, and she prepared this maneuver several moves before. Black's pieces are already active. Bishop on d7 could be improved slightly with bishop b5, but the least active piece is the king. And Judith knew that the d4 square was the ideal square, and that the simple route to get there would come through d8, c7, and b6, and white is too passive to do anything. So black started marching over. King f8, rook b1, king e8, king d8. I just want to add, if white played h4, intending h5, we would always close the position with g5, and if white ever plays g5, we would just close the position with h5. White has no good pawn levers, white has no activity, white has no open files, white has no diagonals, so we can do whatever we want, and what we want is to postulate the king. So we continue to do so. King c7, king b6, king c5, king d4, and finally we activate the lesser valuable piece. I'd like to point out the king is worth 4 points, the bishop is worth 3 in terms of activity. This doesn't always come out in the middle game, but it is an endgame principle. You want to activate your biggest piece first, and the king is much bigger than the bishop. The white pawn on d3 falls, and with it, his position.
Just goes to show it's never too early to apply the king postulate.
Indeed.
And that concludes this position. So, Elijah, in the end game, what's worth more? A pawn or an active king?
An active king, of course.
Right here, white plays c5. It's white's dream to get the king to e5 and f6 and to g7 to try to promote. In this game, black played king takes c5, king e5, and there's no way for black to stop the advancement of the king, and eventually, black resigned.
Black's rating in this game was almost 2750 FIDE. He was Morozevich, actually. This was in the Tal Memorial 2006. But black had the improvement on move 1. After c5, black could have played king e7, preventing white's idea. White would have improved his king for free and advanced the pawn on c5, but black has very serious drawing chances, as analysis shows. But that's besides the point. Black will just repeat move for a while, and white's the one who has to prove he will make progress. But it's far too easy if you accept the pawn sacrifice, if you will, to activate the king, as white will soon win the pawn back and have dangerous passed pawns.
I agree. That concludes this position.
What is our least active piece?
How about the king on f8?
And where would we like to put it?
As far as possible in the enemy territory.
Oh, so then e1, of course. It seems like we're going to have time to do that because they don't have a rook. I mean, they do have a rook, but it's going to sit forever because the king will never move. We've cut the king off. The pawn structure prevents black from ever moving. He can't change the pawn structure, so he's just going to have to sit and wait, and we'll do whatever we want, which is, of course, to activate our king. In the game, we played black played king e7, a4, rook d4. Black just took his time. Bishop e2, king f6, h4, king e5, rook b1, king f4. When you have time, you should improve your least active piece. Grandmaster Jacob Agard makes that clear in his excellent book, Positional Play. g5, h takes g5, h takes g5, king f2, bishop h5, king e1, f6. There's nothing white can do. Takes. We've improved the king. What next? Of course, we improve the least active piece and postulate the rook. Rook d2. This would not have been possible without king e1. We're playing on the opposite color of his bishop, of course, so he doesn't have any pieces except for knight. That's not going to be enough to defend. Rook a1, rook c2 check, king b1, knight f1. We're threatening checkmate, and white resigned because if knight e4 defending this, we have knight e2 check, takes, and white will have to move his bishop and cannot stop rook c1 checkmate.
And that concludes this position.
This is another classic king walk, and we often are able to improve our king directly when they have a weak color complex for us to invade on. In this case, the dark squares are weak because all of the pawns are on light squares, and so we have a clear road straight to the center where it belongs, and actually close to the opponent's king where it will be included in the attack. White just simply plays king g3, and black's pieces are very passive. There isn't anything much he can do. White's just going to play king f4, king e5, king f6, king f7, and then checkmate. That's what happened in the game, and that concludes this position. White's in a tough spot here. Black's threatening mate in 1, the bishop can never capture the knight because of a pin, but right now the black king is in check, so what is black to do? Well, he's not going to retreat and give back the rook, of course, so you just keep charging ahead, as you usually should. Rook f6 check, king e3, rook e5. Is black in trouble? Is he losing his knight that was going to give mate? No! The king is a fighting piece. In the endgame, the middle game, and always, king f2, rook takes e2, king f1. The king is included in the attack, replacing the knight. Now checkmating one is threatened, and black resigned, because if he plays rook takes g2, h takes g2 is checkmate.
And that concludes this position. So this endgame is a composition that came from Logozar Kamsky, that came from Titled Tuesday a few months ago. And we'll notice that our pieces are pretty well placed. Though we're down to the exchange, we have a very active rook in the center. We have a bishop supporting. Both are attacking the e3 pawn, forcing white to defend with both of his rooks. And our king is very well invaded on a2. However, our king is not really able to contribute to the attack on the e3 pawn. Notice that if we were trying to march it to b3 and then c2, the rook is blocking. And there's no real way to include this king on the attack on this pawn.
But we need to move the king anyway, because otherwise they're going to play b4 check, and we can't allow that, of course.
Of course. So the first move is obvious, after king to b3.
But the real question is, where does the king belong? That's what Jacob Agard says when we're trying to focus mainly on piece improvement. And this is clearly a slow position because white doesn't have any open files and doesn't have any plan.
Exactly. White might have one plan where he could move the king to f2 to defend the pawn. However, notice the pawn e3 is pinned by the bishop, meaning at no point can white actually support the e3 pawn with anything other than his rooks.
And then we would play rook takes f4, winning a pawn, and just return back with f4 coming soon.
So if you could place the king on b3 anywhere on the board, where would you place it, Elijah?
I would place it somewhere on the other side of the board, of course.
How about the h5 pawn?
Oh, I would like that. Two connected passed pawns sound good to me.
Okay. And you'll notice that white doesn't really have any play here, so he's stuck repeating moves, king on h2, back to g2, over and over. Now we march our king all the way from the a2 square to the other side of the board, facing absolutely no
It's
resistance.
possible that white could have put his king on h4, but that would be too risky in view of bishop e7 check, and we would still take the h5 pawn.
Exactly. Now after we take the h5 pawn,
It's also possible that white could have played rook h1 earlier, but dropping e3 would be very risky, and then the f4 pawn would fall soon after that, and black would still have connected passed pawns.
of course. Now you might think though that even though we have a pretty good position here, it's not over. I think that we need to postulate our king yet a second time.
But to do that, we can't do that in this pawn structure, so we're going to have to change the pawn structure soon. And right now, rook h6 check or rook takes h7 is too dangerous, therefore we need to exchange a pair of rooks.
Yes.
But we want to use passed pawns here, so we prepare bishop e7 and h4.
After rook e2, we can absolutely not let the enemy rook postulate to e8 and invade, so we need to go king f7 to prevent that.
Which also prepares bishop e7 followed by h4.
Of course. Now after rook to h2, we have a decision. We can repeat moves and take a draw. After all of that, I don't think so.
Who has time for drawing these days?
What we need to do is march that king up the board.
So we widen the beachhead with d4.
Now we have made a path for black's king to invade on the queen side.
And as usual, this path is on the same color complex because the opponent made weaknesses.
Exactly. C takes d4, bishop takes, rook takes h5, and this is a sample line that's mostly best moves.
We can win in other ways, but of course best is to activate the king. Rook e2 tries to restrict it, so black tries a different path. King d4, king d3 is prepared.
And now after king to f2, we reintroduce the bishop with check.
White needs to keep the pawn blockaded, and otherwise black will play c5 and play king takes f4 next.
After king back to g3, we postulate our king to e3. After rook c2 and king d3, our king is perfectly placed, and we will soon be taking out the entire white queen side, following up with promotion of the c pawn.
Indeed. And that concludes this position.